Two modal verbs we use to talk about our abilities are can and could. Both can and could are used to talk about having the ability, knowledge, money, or equipment to do something. We use can to talk about our present abilities and could to talk about our past abilities. Here are a couple of example sentences using can. I can swim for hours. I can swim for hours. I can't buy that. I can't buy that. So we use the modal verb can with the main verb to say we have the ability to do the main verb. And as you can see in the second sentence, we can also use the negative form and say what we don't have the money to do. When can't is not contracted, it's written as cannot. So can and not are attached to each other. We also often use can in question forms to ask if someone has the ability. So we can use them in yes or no questions by switching can and the subject. So we can ask, can you swim? Can you play the guitar? And to answer these questions, we can say, yes, I can, or no, I can't. And we can add WH words in front of yes or no questions to form WH word questions. So we can ask, how well can you swim? What can you play? Now, to talk about our past abilities, we simply use could instead of can. And the use of could is exactly the same as can. So we can say, I could swim for hours. I couldn't buy that. So these sentences mean that I had the ability to swim for hours and I didn't have enough money to buy that. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned to use can and could to talk about our abilities. And we learned that we use can to talk about our present abilities and could to talk about our past abilities. Be able to is a phrase we often use instead of can and could. It's made up of the be verb, the adjective able, and a to infinitive phrase. This phrase has the same meaning as can and could. For example, in the previous lesson, we learned to say, I can swim for hours and I could swim for hours. However, we could also say, I'm able to swim for hours and I was able to swim for hours. So we conjugate the be verb to the present or the past tense and match it with the subject. The sentences have the same meaning, though it's more common to use can and could in these instances. However, there are verb structures where we cannot use can and could. And in these structures, we use to be able to. First, to be able to can be used in many other tenses. So we can use it in the past tense as seen here, but it can be used in a variety of tenses, such as the past perfect, the present perfect, and the future simple. So if we need to express can and could in other tenses, then we use to be able to. Also, we can use to be able to with other modal verbs. And this is an important feature as modal verbs are never used with other modal verbs. So we can say, I may be able to swim, I should be able to swim, and I must be able to swim. So in these structures, be able to swim acts as the main verb, and they are modified by the modal verbs. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned how we use the phrase to be able to instead of can and could in many different tenses and also with other modal verbs. Modal verbs we use to talk about probability are can, could, may, and might. Now, we use the modal verb can to state something we believe to be true or to be usually the case. Consider the following two sentences. It can rain unexpectedly in London. Children can get hungry after school. Now these statements are a mix of what we believe to be true and to be usually the case with London and also with children. So we're saying that we believe it can rain unexpectedly in London, and this is usually the case. Also, we believe children can get hungry after school, and this is usually the case. However, when we use could, may, and might, the statements are more of what's possible rather than what's true or usually the case. Consider these sentences. It could rain unexpectedly in London. Children may get hungry after school. The first sentence states that it is possible for the weather to become wet in London unexpectedly. And the speaker may be talking to someone planning a trip to London and could be saying this to advise that person about the possibility of the weather in London. In the second sentence, we're talking about the possibility of children getting hungry. And this may be because the children had a busy day at school, so there is a chance that the children are hungry. So these statements are not what we believe to be true or to be the usual case, but of possible situations in the near future. Now, might is also used in the same way as could and may. But the only slight difference is that might describes a weaker possibility than could and may. So, children might get hungry after school means that it is possible for the children to get hungry, but we're less sure of this than in sentences that use may and could. Let's look at another set of example sentences using all four modal verbs from this lesson. The cinema can be hot. The cinema could be hot. The cinema may be hot. The cinema might be hot. So the first sentence describes what we believe to be true, and the next three sentences are about what's possible, though might expresses less certainty. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned to use the modal verbs can, could, may, and might to talk about probability of events in the future. In the make request, we commonly use the modal verbs can, could, will, and would. Let's begin with the most common modal verbs we use to make requests, can and could. Here are two requests using can and could. Can you pass me my bag? Could you pass me my bag? To form requests using can and could, we first use the modal verb, then the subject, which is usually you, and then the verb infinitive. Both can and could are frequently used to make polite requests. However, if you're in a situation where you need to be more polite, then you should use could, as could is more polite than can. We can also use will and would to form polite requests. So we can say, will you close the window? Would you close the window? The structure of the question is the same as can and could. So we first use a modal verb, and then the subject, which again is usually you, and after that the verb infinitive. As mentioned already, using both will and would is polite. However, would is more polite and less direct than will, so if you need to be more polite, you should use would to make requests. In terms of meaning, using can and could has the nuance of asking whether the other person is able to or whether it's possible for them to fulfill the request. Whereas using will and would has the nuance of asking whether someone is willing to fulfill these requests. So there is a slight difference in the nuance of these requests. Okay, so let's now look at more example requests using these four modal verbs. Will you help me with my homework? Can you help me with my homework? Would you help me with my homework? Could you help me with my homework? So all these questions are polite requests, but the use of would and could is more polite and less direct than the use of will and can. Also, the use of can and could is more about the possibility and the ability of the other person helping, whereas will and would is more about the willingness of the other person to help. So please do keep that in mind. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned to use the modal verbs can, could, will, and
Subscribe
would to
dong
make polite
English
requests.
tutorial.
In the next